Imagine living your whole life in the comfort of familiar routines, never stepping too far outside your safe circle, never daring to venture into the unknown. Now imagine, at the age of 78, deciding to do something that would change everything, embarking on a solo journey around the world. Her name was Dorothy Miller, a quiet, kind-hearted woman from a small town in Vermont. Dorothy had always been the type to play it safe. She married young, raised her children with love and care, and spent her days tending her garden, knitting by the fire, and hosting Sunday dinners for her family. Her home was filled with the scent of fresh-baked pies and the sound of her favorite old records spinning on the RCA player her husband had given her decades ago. It was a simple life, predictable, warm, and familiar. But under the surface, Dorothy carried a quiet longing. She had spent her entire adult life watching travel documentaries on TV, flipping through magazines that showed breathtaking scenes of the Eiffel Tower, the Great Wall of China, and the sparkling blue waters of the Mediterranean. Every time she saw those images, a small ache would stir inside her, a fleeting wish that she could see those places herself. But she always pushed the thought aside. There were bills to pay, children to raise, and later in life, a husband who preferred staying close to home. For nearly 8 decades, Dorothy had never traveled alone. In fact, she'd barely left the country, save for a single trip to Canada with her late husband back in the 1960s. Flying made her nervous, unfamiliar places made her anxious, and she had always believed that adventure was for other people, people braver, younger, stronger. But something shifted as Dorothy approached her 78th birthday. Sitting alone at her kitchen table one quiet evening, she stared out the window at the fading sunset, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and orange. Her house was still and silent, her children grown and living their own busy lives. For the first time, she felt the weight of all the years that had passed, and the sharp realization that if she didn't do something bold now, she might never get another chance. It started as a whisper in her heart. There's more out there. Don't you want to see it? At first, she brushed it off. She was too old, too set in her ways. Who did she think she was to even consider something so daring? But the thought kept returning, stronger each time, filling her quiet moments with visions of distant lands and new experiences. And one crisp autumn morning, Dorothy did something she never imagined she would do. She opened her laptop, searched for round-the-world trips for seniors, and started planning. Her hands trembled as she clicked through images of faraway places, Parisian cafes, sun-drenched beaches in Greece, the bustling markets of Tokyo. The idea felt impossible, but also irresistible. She printed out maps and taped them to the walls of her den. She began researching flights, hotels, and travel insurance. She started making lists, so many lists, jotting down everything from passport renewals to which comfortable shoes would be best for walking tours. Every little step made the dream feel more real. How did a woman who had spent nearly 8 decades rooted in safety and routine find the courage to set out alone and circle the globe at 78? What did she discover, not just in the places she visited, but deep within herself? If you're still here, feel free to subscribe, because Dorothy's incredible journey is just beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. Dorothy Miller's days followed a gentle, unchanging rhythm. Each morning, she woke at precisely 6:30, just as she had for years, the soft chime of her old alarm clock echoing through her quiet house. She'd shuffle into the kitchen, put on a pot of coffee, and sit by the window as the sun rose over her little Vermont town. The same trees, the same streets, the same familiar view she had known all her life. Her home was a time capsule of memories. Family photos lined the shelves, lace curtains fluttered in the breeze, and her favorite rocking chair sat perfectly positioned near the fireplace. There was comfort in the sameness, a certain peace in knowing what each day would bring. Dorothy's life had been built around routines, tending her garden, knitting scarves and blankets for her grandchildren, baking her famous blueberry muffins for church events. Sundays were always the highlight of her week. Her children and grandchildren would gather around the old oak dining table, sharing stories over heaping plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes. Dorothy loved hearing their laughter, watching their faces light up with excitement as they shared tales of their busy lives. But once everyone left and the house grew quiet again, she often felt a small, hollow ache settle in her chest. She had always told herself she was content. After all, she had lived a good life, a life filled with love, family, and tradition. But deep down, there was a quiet restlessness she rarely admitted to anyone. She sometimes found herself lingering a little too long in front of the travel section at the library, her fingers brushing over glossy covers that promised adventure and discovery. She dreamed for a moment, just a moment, of seeing the Eiffel Tower sparkle at night or dipping her toes into the warm sands of a distant shore. But then reality would tug her back. "That's not for me," she'd murmur under her breath, shelving the book and heading home. Her friends often echoed her own thoughts. "Traveling at our age," one would say with a laugh. "That's for the young folks." Another would chime in, "It's too risky now. Best to stay put where it's safe." Dorothy nodded along, smiling politely, but in her heart, she wasn't so sure. Still, fear had a way of wrapping itself around her dreams, whispering doubts every time she dared to think bigger. What if she got lost? What if she fell far from home? What if no one was there to help? And so, year after year, Dorothy stayed within the borders of her familiar world. She lived vicariously through travel shows on her small television, imagining the taste of exotic dishes and the feel of cobblestone streets underfoot, but never truly believing those experiences could be hers. She had built a life of comfort and safety. But what she didn't realize then was that her heart, quietly and persistently, was preparing her for something extraordinary. Because even the most carefully built routines can't stop a dream that refuses to fade. The turning point came one quiet evening in early spring. Dorothy had just finished washing the dinner dishes, the warm scent of lemon soap still lingering in the air, when she sat down with a cup of tea and opened a letter. It was from an old friend, Margaret, who had moved to Italy years earlier. Margaret's handwriting danced across the page, full of stories about her latest adventures, sipping wine in Tuscany, exploring ancient ruins, and making new friends from around the world. Dorothy read every word slowly, her eyes lingering on the bright photographs tucked inside the envelope. One showed Margaret, beaming with joy, standing beneath a breathtaking sunset along the Amalfi Coast. Dorothy's heart clenched with a strange mixture of happiness and longing. As she stared at the pictures, something shifted inside her. A question that had always been buried deep now rose to the surface. Why not me? That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Over and over, she heard her own excuses echo back at her. "You're too old. It's too dangerous. You wouldn't know what to do." But beneath the fear was a spark, tiny, but growing. For the first time in her life, Dorothy wondered what it would feel like to say yes to herself. To step beyond her quiet town, her familiar routines, and see the world with her own eyes. The next morning, over breakfast, she surprised herself by saying the words out loud. I want to travel." Her daughter, Susan, nearly dropped her fork. "Travel? Where, Mom?" Dorothy hesitated, her pulse quickening. "Everywhere," she said softly. "I want to see the world. I want to do it now, before it's too late." Susan stared at her, eyes wide with shock. "But you've never traveled alone. Are you sure?" Dorothy met her gaze, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I've never been more sure." The news rippled through her circle of friends and family, met with a mix of admiration and concern. Some thought she was brave, others quietly thought she was foolish. "At your age," one neighbor whispered, "isn't that dangerous?" Even her closest friends tried to talk her out of it, worried about her safety, her health, her comfort. But Dorothy felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, conviction. Every doubt only strengthened her resolve. For so many years, she had lived by what was expected of her, careful, quiet, safe. But now, at 78, she was ready to live by her own rules. She pulled out an old leather journal and wrote her first entry. "Today I decided to take the biggest journey of my life. I don't know exactly where it will lead, but I know one thing. It's time." And just like that, a new chapter of her life began, one built not on fear, but on courage. Dorothy didn't know it yet, but the adventure ahead would not only take her across oceans and continents, It would transform her from the inside out. Dorothy quickly realized that deciding to travel was only the first step. The real challenge was figuring out how to make it happen. She had no experience booking flights, navigating airports, or planning itineraries. The world of travel seemed overwhelming, filled with confusing terms and endless choices. But she was determined. Her first move was to visit the local library, where she checked out a towering stack of guidebooks, titles like Traveling Solo for Seniors and Around the World on a Budget. She spent hours at her kitchen table, sipping tea and taking notes, her old leather journal filling up with lists and ideas. Every time she crossed off a small task, renewing her passport, ordering a sturdy new suitcase, she felt a spark of pride. Technology, however, was another hurdle. Dorothy wasn't used to online booking systems, so she asked her granddaughter Emily for help. Together, they sat at the computer, clicking through airline websites and hotel reviews. Emily showed her how to use apps that translated foreign languages and helped her set up an international phone plan. "You're braver than I am, Grandma," Emily said with a grin. "Most people wouldn't dream of doing this at your age." Dorothy smiled, though her stomach fluttered with nerves. Inside, she was constantly battling fear of getting lost, of falling ill, of being alone in a strange place with no one to turn to. But each time those fears crept in, she reminded herself why she was doing this, to prove to herself that she was stronger and more capable than she had ever allowed herself to believe. Her friends' reactions were a mixed bag. At their weekly coffee club, the news sparked a flurry of chatter. "I admire your spirit, Dorothy," said Margaret, sipping her cappuccino. "But are you sure it's wise? Traveling alone is no small feat." Dorothy nodded, acknowledging their concerns. "I know it's a risk," she replied softly, "but so is letting life slip by without ever really living." Carol, her most cautious friend, shook her head with a worried frown. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said, squeezing Dorothy's hand. "We need you back safe and sound." Dorothy promised, her heart swelling with both fear and determination. She started small, booking a flight to Paris, her first destination. Next came accommodations, a cozy little hotel near the Seine River, with glowing reviews about its friendly staff and quiet charm. Each booking felt like a tiny victory, a piece of her old dream solidifying into reality. To prepare physically, Dorothy joined a walking club to build stamina and even attended a self-defense class for seniors, learning simple techniques that boosted her confidence. Her suitcase gradually filled with practical items, a reliable travel pillow, a money belt, comfortable walking shoes, and a small, well-worn journal to document her journey. As departure day drew closer, her excitement grew, but so did the butterflies in her stomach. On the night before her flight, Dorothy stood by her window, staring up at the moonlit sky. The world suddenly felt enormous, and she felt very small. But beneath the nerves was something stronger, resolve. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "Tomorrow, everything changes." Little did she know, the moment her plane lifted off the runway would be the start of a journey that would test her limits and open her heart in ways she never imagined. The morning of her departure, Dorothy stood at the airport clutching her boarding pass, her hands slightly trembling. The terminal buzzed with the sound of announcements and hurried travelers, a chaotic world so different from her quiet Vermont home. She took a deep breath, repeating to herself, "You can do this." When her flight was finally called, she stepped onto the plane, her heart racing as she settled into her seat. The moment the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off the runway, Dorothy stared out the window, eyes wide with awe and disbelief. She was doing it. Really doing it. Her first stop was Paris, a city she had dreamed of visiting since she was a girl. But as magical as it sounded in her imagination, reality hit hard when she stepped into Charles de Gaulle Airport. Everything felt overwhelming, the fast-paced crowds, the unfamiliar signs, the foreign language swirling around her. For a moment, panic bubbled up inside her. What was I thinking? She wondered, gripping the handle of her suitcase a little tighter. She approached an information desk, her voice shaky as she asked for directions to the taxi stand. The attendant's French accent was thick, and though kind, his instructions were hard to follow. Dorothy's heart pounded as she wandered the terminal, trying to make sense of it all. She felt small and lost in a sea of strangers. Finally, after a few confusing turns, and with the help of a fellow traveler who noticed her distress, she made it to the taxi line. The driver, a cheerful man named Pierre, helped load her bags and greeted her with a bright "Bienvenue à Paris." His warmth soothed her nerves, and as they drove through the city, Dorothy stared out the window at the charming streets, the cafes, and the sparkling Seine. Her fear began to soften, replaced by wonder. Arriving at her little hotel, Dorothy checked in and was shown to a small but cozy room with a view of the rooftops. She set down her suitcase, sat on the edge of the bed, and let out a long breath. I made it, she thought, tears of relief and pride welling in her eyes. But her challenges weren't over. That evening, determined not to let fear keep her inside, Dorothy ventured out to find dinner. The streets were bustling with life, waiters balancing trays, couples strolling arm in arm, music drifting from open doorways. Dorothy wandered for blocks, nerves tingling, before finally choosing a tiny cafe with twinkling fairy lights. Ordering was another hurdle. The menu was all in French, and her mind went blank despite the phrasebook in her purse. After a few stumbles and some polite laughter from the waiter, she pointed to a dish that sounded vaguely familiar. When it arrived, a steaming bowl of coq au vin, Dorothy smiled and dug in, savoring every bite of her first meal in Paris. Walking back to the hotel under the glow of the city lights, Dorothy felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: brave. It was just the beginning, but already she knew she was stronger than her fears. And somewhere deep inside, she whispered to herself, one day at a time, Dorothy. One beautiful day at a time. As the days passed, Dorothy found herself settling into the rhythm of travel in a way she never expected. Each new city brought a mix of nerves and excitement, but with every step she took, the world began to open itself to her in breathtaking, unforgettable ways. In Paris, she wandered through the cobblestone streets of Montmartre, her eyes lighting up at every corner cafe and artist stall. One afternoon, while sipping coffee near the Sacré-Cœur, a young French woman named Amélie asked if she could share the table. What began as small talk turned into a warm conversation about books, family, and finding courage later in life. Amélie even insisted on showing Dorothy the best local bakery, where they shared warm pain au chocolate and laughter as the sun set over the rooftops. "You remind me of my grandmother," Amélie said with a smile. "She was strong, like you." From France, Dorothy traveled south to Florence, Italy. The air was warmer, the streets livelier, and the food was like something from a dream. She took a cooking class in a rustic kitchen nestled among olive groves, where she learned to make fresh pasta by hand. The instructor, a boisterous woman named Rosa, clapped her on the back and declared, "You have good hands, Nana." Dorothy laughed so hard she cried. In Greece, she sat on a quiet beach in Santorini, the sound of waves gently crashing as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and violet. She ran her fingers through the sand and let the breeze tangle her hair. For the first time in decades, she felt completely at peace, with no schedule to keep and no one to please but herself. Each country brought new sights and surprises: a street festival in Lisbon where she danced with strangers to lively music, a quiet afternoon in Kyoto walking through bamboo forests, a boat ride along the canals of Amsterdam where she watched the world drift by like a watercolor painting. But it wasn't just the places that moved her, it was the people. The kind strangers who offered directions without being asked. The children who waved at her from balconies. The hotel staff who called her Miss Dorothy and greeted her each morning with smiles and questions about her day. Every moment chipped away at the old fears she had carried. She began to trust herself more, to navigate, to ask questions, to adapt. There was a sense of freedom in knowing she didn't need anyone else to show her the way. She had become her own compass. And she recorded it all, every emotion, every funny misunderstanding, every magical view, in her worn leather journal. "Today, I walked the streets of Florence with gelato dripping down my hand," one entry read. "And I laughed, out loud, alone, and didn't care who saw." Dorothy had stepped into the world afraid and unsure. But somewhere along the way, she began to realize she wasn't just traveling. She was becoming. And she was falling in love with the world. Yes, but even more so, with the woman she was discovering inside herself. Not every day of Dorothy's journey was painted with sunshine and joy. There were moments, hard, uncomfortable moments, that tested her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening in Rome, after a long day of sightseeing, Dorothy returned to her hotel room to find herself feeling suddenly, deeply alone. The silence of the small room seemed heavier than usual, and for the first time in weeks, a wave of sadness washed over her. She missed her family, her friends, even the simple comforts of home, the familiar smell of her kitchen, the sound of her old clock ticking in the hallway. She sat by the window, staring out at the glowing city lights, and tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. What am I doing here? She wondered. Maybe everyone was right. I'm too old for this. But instead of packing her bags and giving in to the loneliness, Dorothy pulled out her journal and began to write. She poured her heart onto the pages, letting the sadness, the fear, and the doubts flow out. And somehow, by the time she finished, she felt lighter, like the act of acknowledging her feelings gave her the strength to carry on. Another test came in Bangkok, Thailand. While navigating the bustling streets, Dorothy took a wrong turn and found herself completely lost. The noise, the crowds, and the unfamiliar language made her pulse race with panic. For a few minutes, she stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching her bag, her mind a blur. But then she remembered Emily's words. Grandma, just breathe and ask for help. People are kinder than you think. Summoning her courage, Dorothy approached a young woman at a fruit stand and, with a mix of gestures and broken English, explained that she was lost. The woman's face lit up with a smile, and without hesitation, she walked Dorothy all the way back to her hotel. Grateful tears welled in Dorothy's eyes as she thanked her over and over. That experience reminded her that kindness speaks every language. And then there was the time in Sydney when Dorothy caught a nasty cold that left her bedridden for days. Alone in her hotel room, tissues piled on the nightstand, she worried about how she'd manage if things got worse. But instead of spiraling into fear, she took things one step at a time, calling the front desk for medicine, resting, and reminding herself that she was stronger than she felt. Each obstacle, while difficult in the moment, became a badge of honor once overcome. Dorothy realized that the hardest moments weren't signs of failure, they were proof of her resilience. She learned that it was okay to be scared sometimes. It was okay to cry, to feel lost, to miss home. What mattered was that she kept moving forward, one brave step at a time. And as she looked back at each of those challenges, Dorothy found herself thinking, I didn't just survive those moments, I grew because of them. What she couldn't know then was that the greatest reward of her journey was still waiting just ahead. After months on the road, Dorothy's journey was nearing its end. Her passport, once crisp and clean, was now thick with stamps from every corner of the world, a patchwork of memories inked in every page. Each city, each experience, had left its mark not only in her documents but deep within her heart. Her final stop was London, a city she had always dreamed of visiting. As her plane descended through the gray clouds, Dorothy pressed her forehead to the window, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and disbelief. I made it, she thought. I really made it. In London, Dorothy allowed herself to slow down and savor the last chapter of her grand adventure. She strolled along the Thames, watching boats glide past, and marveled at the grandeur of Big Ben, its chimes echoing through the crisp morning air. She visited the famous Tower of London, stood on the historic Tower Bridge, and spent a quiet afternoon in Hyde Park, feeding ducks and reflecting on how far she had come. On her last evening abroad, Dorothy treated herself to a fancy dinner at a small restaurant tucked away in a quiet alley. Candlelight flickered across white linen tablecloths, and the air was filled with the soft murmur of conversation. Sitting alone, dressed in her best scarf and holding a glass of champagne, Dorothy smiled as she looked around. She didn't feel out of place or self-conscious, not anymore. Instead, she felt powerful, peaceful, and incredibly alive. The waiter approached with a gentle smile. Celebrating something special tonight, madam? Dorothy's eyes sparkled. Yes, she said softly. I'm celebrating myself. That night, back at her hotel, she opened her journal and wrote her final entry of the trip. I came into this journey unsure, afraid, and full of doubts. I am leaving it stronger, braver, and more in love with life than ever before. This was never just about the places I visited. It was about discovering the woman I've always been capable of becoming. When the day came to board her flight home, Dorothy stood at the airport gate and glanced around at the other travelers, young backpackers, business people, families with children. She no longer felt like the odd one out. She felt like she belonged to the world now. As the plane lifted off, Dorothy looked out at the patchwork of London's lights fading beneath her and whispered, "Thank you." Not just to the city she had seen, but to herself for being brave enough to take that first terrifying step. She knew that when she returned home, people would ask her what her favorite place had been. And she'd smile, knowing the real answer, the place within herself that she had finally learned to trust. But what she couldn't know yet was just how much her story would inspire others, lighting sparks of courage in people who had been quietly waiting for permission to chase their own dreams. When Dorothy's plane finally touched down in Vermont, the familiar landscape rolled out beneath her like an old, comforting quilt. But as she stepped off the plane, suitcase in hand, she knew deep down that something fundamental had shifted. This was the same place she had left months ago, but she was no longer the same woman. Her daughter Susan was waiting at the arrival's gate, her eyes wide and shining with emotion. "Mom," she cried, wrapping Dorothy in a tight embrace. "You did it. You really did it." Dorothy hugged her back fiercely, laughing and tearing up all at once. "I did," she whispered, "and it was everything I hoped it would be and more." Back at home, Dorothy stepped through the door and took a deep breath. The house smelled exactly as she remembered: fresh linen, a hint of lavender, and the soft, sweet scent of the pies she'd baked countless times. Everything looked just as she'd left it, yet it all felt brand new. She wandered through each room, her fingers brushing over the familiar furniture, the old photographs, the bookshelves crammed with stories. But something inside her was different now. She no longer saw her home as a place of limitation. It was now her base, her launching pad for whatever came next. Dorothy had crossed oceans, scaled fears, and stepped far outside the borders of her comfort zone. And though her passport was full, her spirit felt even fuller. Her friends gathered a week later to welcome her home, eager to hear every detail. They sat around the old oak table, eyes wide with wonder as Dorothy shared stories of Parisian cafes, the blue-domed churches of Santorini, and getting lost in the bustling streets of Bangkok. Laughter filled the room as she recounted her travel blunders, like accidentally ordering sheep's brain stew in Morocco and gracefully pretending to enjoy every bite. "I don't think I could ever do what you did," Margaret said, shaking her head with admiration. Dorothy smiled warmly. "I used to think that too," she replied. "But we're stronger than we realize. Sometimes it just takes a leap of faith to remind us." And the truth was, Dorothy hadn't just brought back souvenirs or photos, she'd brought back confidence. The kind of quiet, unshakable belief that stays with you long after the adventure ends. She began joining new clubs, taking art classes, and even mentoring other seniors who were thinking of traveling solo. Her story became a ripple of inspiration in her little town, sparking conversations about courage and second chances. One crisp morning, as Dorothy sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the leaves dance in the breeze, she reflected on everything she had experienced. She thought about the scared woman who had once stared at the same trees, wondering if adventure was out of reach. And she smiled, realizing now that the adventure had always been waiting, just on the other side of fear. She had left seeking the world and returned having found herself. Dorothy often found herself sitting by her window in the months after her journey, watching the sun rise over her quiet town. The same streets, the same houses, the same trees she'd always known, but now she saw them through new eyes. Travel hadn't just shown her the world, it had shown her the depth of her own strength. She had once believed that independence and adventure belonged to the young, to those unburdened by years and responsibilities. But standing beneath the Eiffel Tower, lost in a crowded Bangkok market, and sitting alone on a quiet beach in Greece had taught her otherwise. Independence wasn't about age or circumstance. It was about saying yes to yourself, even when the world expects you to say no. Dorothy's journey had started as a daring escape from routine, but it had become something far greater, a journey back to herself. Every country, every challenge, every moment of awe had added a new layer to her confidence. And that confidence stayed with her, shaping her days in ways both big and small. She noticed it in the way she spoke up more, the way she offered advice to younger women who doubted their own strength. She noticed it in the ease with which she tackled new hobbies and in her willingness to try things that once seemed impossible. Dorothy had unlocked something inside her, a quiet, powerful belief that life is meant to be lived fully, no matter your age. To anyone watching this right now, Dorothy has a message just for you. Don't let fear write your story. Whether it's traveling the world, starting a new chapter, or simply taking that first small step toward a long-held dream, it's never too late. Age isn't a barrier, it's a badge of honor, proof that you've lived, learned, and are more than ready for whatever comes next. Her story isn't just about planes and passports. It's about freedom, the kind that comes when you realize you don't need permission to chase what sets your soul on fire. So I want to ask you, what dream have you been quietly holding on to? What adventure, big or small, is waiting just on the other side of your comfort zone? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. We are a community of dreamers here, and your voice matters. And if Dorothy's incredible journey touched your heart, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Here, we celebrate stories of courage, resilience, and the unstoppable spirit of those who prove that dreams have no expiration date. Because it's never too late to dream.